Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Lane County Board of Commissioners afternoon session for our Tuesday, March 15th meeting. Our first item is item 12. It's under Public Works. It is, the second reading and public hearing for ordinance number PA 1320 in the matter of amending the Rural Comprehensive Plan to redesignate land from forest to marginal land and rezone land from impacted forest land F2 to marginal land ML/SR with site review and adopting savings and severability clauses, file number 509-PA14-05807, and the applicant is Kirby. So I'll try to go through my script here and then we'll do our staff report. So this decision is subject to a plan amendment and other criteria cited in the agenda cover memo and amendments. Evidence and testimony must be directed toward the approval criteria, and failure to raise an issue to enable a response may preclude appeal to LUBA. So this is the opportunity for those present to enter information into the record. Only persons who qualify as party may appeal the board's decision to LUBA. So at this time, I'd like to call for any ex parte contact amongst our board. I'm not seeing any. So we'll say no to the ex parte contact. And so now we'll move into, I believe, the staff report. So we have Lindsay. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. The application before you today is a minor plan amendment to redesignate approximately 19.7 acres of forest land to marginal land, and that's under the approval criteria of Land Code Chapter 16400, and it's also subject to the 1991 version of ORS 197.247, which is the marginal land specific criteria. Along with the plan amendment application, there's also a request for a concurrent zone change to rezone approximately 60.07 acres of impacted forest land to marginal land zone pursuant to Land Code 16252. The subject property is composed of 2 tax lots totaling slightly over 60 acres. In 1966, the subject property was first zoned AGT, and then in 1984, the property was rezoned by the county to impacted forest land, or F2. The northern 40 acres of the property is within the Metro Plan boundary and has been designated forest land since 1982. The remaining southern portion of the property, slightly under 20 acres, is within the boundaries of the Rural Comprehensive Plan and is also designated forest land since 1984, so pretty close time frames there. The Metro Plan does not have plan designations or a plan designation of marginal lands, so we're not proposing to change that designation on that northern part of the property, but it does have provisions and policies in place to allow the zone change to occur as long as we make adequate findings for those policies. The subject property is located southwest of Eugene off Willow Creek Road and then subsequently off of Reynolds Drive. The surrounding vicinity is comprised of forest land, residential land, and a handful of marginal land zoned properties. This application was submitted to the county on December of 2014. Staff reviewed the application for completeness in June of 2015, where staff deemed the application incomplete. Since that time, staff worked with the applicant's agent and compiled additional information in order to complete the application packet, and the application was deemed complete on November 5th, 2015. We took the application before the Planning Commission in January of 2016. So to the criteria, I'm going to give you a real brief overview of the marginal lands criteria and how it relates to this application. Because the marginal lands applications are slightly different than a normal plan amendment, because it's governed specifically by the 1991 version of the ORS 197-247. In March of 1997, the board issued a directive on how to interpret and administer marginal lands applications. There's a lot of case law that provides guidance for both applicants and staff, and so we kind of use all of those documents together to administer these applications. This application has kind of a two-part test that they need to meet. The first part is that they must comply with an income test, where the applicant must document that the land is less than commercial grade for farm or forest use between 1978 and 1983. And then the second option, there's kind of three options. Two are parcelization tests, looking at the properties in that area. And the third is a productivity test relating to soil capability, and that third option is what this applicant has chosen to do or to utilize. They have demonstrated that the farm soil capability is predominantly class 5 through 8 soil types out of a 1 through 8 scale, as well as per acre, the proposed land cannot produce on average more than 85 cubic feet of merchantable timber annually. The applicant has provided documentations and findings showing that the subject property complies with all of that marginal lands criteria. They've also supplied findings that staff has reviewed and agree with for all of the local and state regulations for plan amendments. So in the staff report, I highlighted I had four highlights of the findings that I wanted to bring up. One was regarding the Goal 5 analysis that the applicant completed to show that their potential density of one house per 20 acres will minimally conflict with peripheral big game habitat. And the applicant has justified that the minimal conflict is acceptable when considering all aspects of the ESE analysis that's required. Per the Metro Plan Policy C7 little c, forest lands that satisfy the requirements of ORS 197-247 may be designated marginal lands. So that's within the forest policies of the Metro Plan. So that's the policy that allows us to zone the property marginal lands but have it be designated forest land. Another policy that's important to point out of the Metro Plan under the forest policies is that new structures must comply with siting and fire safety standards. And that is why we're requesting a site review overlay to trigger the review of siting standards for all new structures on this property, even once it has a zoning designation of marginal lands, which normally would not trigger the fire siting standards. I also wanted to point out that per Lane Code 15697C, the county engineer waived the requirements for a traffic impact analysis for the subject property for this application. He was specific to note that the waiver does not preclude the county's ability to analyze traffic impacts for any future development proposals. So a summary of what happened at our Planning Commission in January. We had 2 meetings. The public hearing, there was some missing information, and so the Planning Commission held the record open for an additional week. They had closed the public hearing, but left it open for additional information, and held deliberations later on in January. And so some of the information that was talked about during the public hearing were that multiple neighbors testified that they personally experienced water quantity issues, so they are having well water issues, and they're very concerned about adding additional dwellings to the area. The applicant's agent at the public hearing testified that he'd been in contact with the local water master through the Department of Water Resources, who said 20-acre parcels, which is what this proposal would allow for, would not be a cause for water quantity concerns. I followed up with an email and have included that in the record, that the water master concurred with those statements. Landwatch Lane County also testified at the Planning Commission. They brought up an issue of whether or not the subject property was a legal lot, and we reviewed the approval criteria, and that does not appear to be one of the approval criteria for a plan amendment zone change. It will be before they are able to develop the property with a dwelling or land division or anything of that sort. Whether or not this application moves forward prior to any development, we do review legal lot status, but it's not an approval criteria for this application. The Planning Commission found that the applicant presented evidence to satisfy the two-part marginal lands amendment and zone change criteria, and they forwarded a recommendation of approval to the board after their careful review. And so earlier today, just before lunch, we did receive a letter via email from Landwatch, provided copies to you on your desk. We were able to read through the letter. It seems that the two main topics were, again, questioning the legal lot status of the subject property, for which we have not completed a legal lot verification on the property, so doesn't know if it's a legal lot or not. But again, we've reviewed the criteria. It doesn't appear to be a criteria for this application. The other concerns that Landwatch raised were regarding the applicant's ESEE analysis, specifically in respect to the peripheral big game habitat. And I'd like to let the applicant's agent speak to their analysis that they conducted and answer any questions about that. I haven't had time to thoroughly review the statements. That said, staff still is recommending approval of this application today without any modifications for adoption of Ordinance PA 1320 as presented. Thank you.
Questions? Comments? Commissioner Like?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for addressing the letter we received, because I will say I was a little confused on the cover letter. It says our request to keep the record open for 1 week, but yet in the back of it, the conclusion is we oppose. Why would you want to keep the record open for a week if you already oppose it? Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay. Other comments or questions before I open the public hearing? Okay, seeing none, I'll now open the public hearing. At this time, we'll look for the first, well, there's only one person signed up, and I believe it's Carl Mueller. I assume that's the applicant's testimony, right?
Correct.
All right.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Carl Mueller. I am the applicant for the agent. Obviously, we're happy to be here this afternoon, this hopefully being the culmination of a a pretty long project. I actually first looked at this back in 2007. Of course, intervening events in the market, etc., so sort of halted this project for a while, but we're glad to be here now, kind of hopefully at the end of a long road. As Lindsay noted, really the ultimate aim of this application is to change the zoning of the entire property from F2 to marginal land, which would then allow smaller lot sizes, 2 additional houses perhaps in excess of what would be currently permitted in the F2 zone. Let's see, Ms. Eichner kind of covered the location, which I had next. Just briefly, of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, Lane County being a marginal lands county sets forth that zoning designation and provides that it's permissible if certain criteria of state law are met. Essentially, at least with regard to the tests, the Lane Code implements the state law verbatim. As Lindsay noted, the requirements that we had to meet were kind of the gatekeeper provisions that, we'd look at before any of these other issues. Was the proposed marginal land managed during 3 of 5 years between 1978 and 83 as part of a farm operation that produced $20,000 in gross annual income, or a forest operation that was capable of producing $10,000 in gross annual income over the growth cycle of the species. The property was not managed as part of a farm operation. Of course, this gets to the issue of what management means, and when it comes to a farm operation, no activity on the property is essentially evidence that it's not a farm. Now, from 1978 to 83, or at no time, have there been any clearings, any pastures, any barns, any fences, any livestock on the site, any grazing activity, any crops grown, or any other any haying, anything indicative of farming activity. The primary way we're able to piece this together is through the aerial photography of the site, which we provided in our application, showing the property unchanged at any time from 78 to 83. With regard to the issue of forest management, just simply the act of not converting the property to another use is sufficient evidence of management as a forest operation for the purposes of the statute. So they weren't doing anything else there, so it was managed as part of a forest operation. However, it was not capable of producing $10,000 in gross annual income over the growth cycle. We provided the consulting forester's report using all the LUBA approved methodologies, all the appropriate log prices, demonstrating that the highest yield on an annual basis from the property would have been $2,690, so approximately a quarter of the threshold. So we're not definitely not even pushing that threshold. So then, having met kind of both prongs of that initial analysis, then, as Lindsay noted, we moved into there's then some alternate tests. You can select the route you're going to take. We ended up with looking at the soil productivity aspects of it. The soils, as noted, are not predominantly, or rather are in classes 5 through 8. They're mostly class 6 soils, about 65% are class 6. The property is not capable of producing 85 cubic feet per acre per year. It actually is capable of producing about 46 cubic feet per acre per year, so it actually is almost even below the kind of commonly accepted and used threshold for resource land in the county, let alone marginal. I guess because sort of the structure of the code, it's a little bit elegant organization at least, is a little bit difficult. One of the things we have to do is show compliance with the Rural Comprehensive Plan governing the plan amendments. Our view is that the amendment that we proposed is justified as it's necessary either to correct an error in the application of the plan. It's also necessary for implementation of plan policy, and is also otherwise desirable, appropriate, and proper. Just briefly, the application of the F2 zone and the forest land designation is in error because it is inconsistent with the site capabilities and limitations. Generally, forest land in Lane County has a timber productivity threshold of 50 cubic feet per acre per year. We're not even meeting that threshold, so we're clearly marginal with regard to our resource capacities. It's also necessary to implement adopted plan policy, specifically Goal 4, Policy 3, which provides that land meets the requirements of marginal land may be designated marginal land. We obviously would have to undertake this application to implement that policy. We are compliant with all additional relevant rural comprehensive plan policies. Water concerns are a concern that have been brought up and addressed by the applicant. We believe that at this time we've satisfied the requirement that it's a major consideration. We've had, and which there, to a certain extent, there was more that they could provide, but the verbal communication with the water master prior to the application, which indicated that at 20 acres in this area specifically, that the probability of interference is low. We have also supplied the well log data for your review for basically every well in the vicinity of a mile, so it's possible, to make that consideration of what's going on with water in the area. We've also in the record provided a deed, which is, I believe, part of Exhibit 8, and in that deed, which is 9127917, that references the rights of Amos Johnson and his successors in interest to access the spring on the property. So from the evidence that's available in the record, we've also provided the well log that shows that there's a well on the site that's producing water. So those things kind of taken in combination, we believe that we've demonstrated that there is adequate water, and again, that will be subject to review later at the time of land division as well. So we believe for the purposes of this application, we've provided enough evidence to make the determination that we can go forward, and then again, that'll be analyzed at a later date as well. And then finally, we would argue that it's necessary and proper to designate the land as marginal land. It has poor ag soil and is marginally productive at best for timber, and the designation, the requested zoning district, reflects an earlier policy determination that marginally productive resource lands are better used and developed potentially, or are more likely to be used beneficially when developed at a higher density than other resource lands. Subject property is also located as near as possible to Eugene's UGB, really, if you're going to have rural residences. This is about as close as you can get to minimize commuting times, availability of services, all of these things. So we believe it's an appropriate location for it. The transportation infrastructure is there. It's very close to Eugene's UGB. Another requirement we have to meet is consistency with the statewide planning goals. I don't want to go through pedantically all of those. Statewide, we're consistent with statewide planning goal 4, the property, which provides for the protection of forest lands, being those suitable for commercial forest use. And then goal 5, compliance, and that's sort of one of the bigger one and kind of an evolving situation. I know there's only been a few applications that actually have done a complete ESE analysis. Previously, the county had just deferred analysis of these goal 5 matters until a later date, and that had sort of been how it was dealt with since the time of the adoption of the Rural Comprehensive Plan in 1984. Now, for whatever reason, that reconsideration with regard to lot sizes and conflict with resources hasn't occurred, so we're doing this now on a case-by-case basis with each application. So we looked as best we could to identify what significant goal 5 resources might be present on the site. There we found, of course, that the property is peripheral, big game range. The analysis that we did is, I believe, the most complete goal 5 analysis that's been done to date of any approved application since kind of the new policy has gone in. I could potentially, I guess, speak more about that later, specifically when I go through Land Watch's objections, but I'd say we looked at, road densities in the area within 1, 2, and 3 miles. We looked at housing density in the area within 1, 2, and 3 square miles. We looked at cover, forage availability. We sought to find out from ODFW what's going on with elk, deer in the county, what's happening. I mean, I know in the Land Watch statement it says that a verbal communication is not evidence, unfortunately. What I got from ODFW with regard to, hey, what's going on with elk in the county was essentially, yeah, there's a herd over by Crow Road in Lorain. Okay, so there really wasn't a whole lot to go on from ODFW. So with that in mind, then we turn to the species management plans from ODFW, looking at each single species that could be present on site. What's their status in the state of Oregon? What are their habitat needs? How does this application affect them? I think that we feel good about the Goal 5 analysis that we've submitted. Like I said, I'll look at some of the specific objections in here. But with regard to, say, road densities, for example, we looked at. Now, for elk, for example, they tend to prefer deeper cover. A limiting factor for elk and the way that the model worked for figuring out if it was good elk habitat or not, unfortunately, if you have really great habitat with the way the model worked with 4 variables, if you have one of the variables is poor quality, the other ones don't work as compensation. So whereas here or anywhere you have really great habitat for elk, but if you have high road density, it won't matter. They won't utilize that habitat. So that's sort of a situation that we have here. Is the area is already developed. There are a lot of roads, so there's already some substantial limiting factors. For elk, for deer, we believe that there are plenty of deer. We don't believe this, and we believe we have evidence in the record showing the number of deer in the state. The population is healthy, given what everybody knows about deer habitat in Lane County, Eugene, South Hills. I wouldn't anticipate this to be severely impacting to a negative extent the deer population. Cougar are a little more elusive, but they're about 5,200 in the state. The kind of densities and kind of ranges that they have, 10 square miles or so, and even in the most productive habitats, you wouldn't expect this level of development, particularly where this level of development already exists, to really further seriously deplete habitat or these populations. So that's what I'll say, I guess, with regard to statewide planning goals for the time being. The proposal is consistent with the Metro Plan. I think Ms. Eichner covered that fairly well. And then the zone change criteria is sort of broad, being enacted to ensure the general purpose of the chapter. Let's see. And we'd say that it is consistent with the general purpose of the chapter. We ensure that the applicable zoning district is commensurate with the character and physical limitations of the land, meaning, of course, it's lack of timber productivity, it's lack of agricultural productivity. We would aver that the proposal conserves forest land for the production of timber products because the marginal lands district is applied to marginally productive forest lands, partly in order to make continued resource utilization more likely. The proposal makes sound economical use of land as provided by 16003 sub 6 because the pursuit of resource activities on marginal lands will require more intensive energy inputs and effort. That's another reason why we have these smaller lot sizes, why the marginal land districts provides those smaller lot sizes. The proposal is not contrary to the public interest. It is entirely consistent with the development patterns in the vicinity of the proposed development. It will not result in any severe or deleterious impacts to significant resources that are in need of protection. It is also consistent with the purpose of the marginal land zone, which provides that the zone is intended to make economically beneficial use of marginally productive lands and to allow people to reside in a rural environment. So it's our position that the approval of the request is desirable, appropriate, and proper, as it will further the purpose of the Marginal Lands District. In conclusion, we feel that we've met all the approval criteria, the county ordinances, as well as any state law, as well as being consistent with the statewide planning goals, the rural comprehensive plan, and the application of the marginal lands zoning district, and the precedent of how it has been applied throughout the county, and request approval of our application. Now, as you know, these other comments came in requesting that the record be held open for an additional week to maybe flesh out some of these things that are in here. I don't know, or actually, I don't know why. Sort of like the county staff, I haven't had the chance to as thoroughly review it as I would like to, perhaps by design. However, with regard to the first objection being the legal lot status, this was brought up in the Planning Commission hearing. The Planning Commission heard what we had to say about it. That issue has also been considered by the Planning Commission. And essentially, it's irrelevant. Legal lot status is not one of the approval criteria for this application. Deliberations being limited to actual approval criteria. So in that respect, it's not relevant. I mean, every lot, I mean, just from a common sense standpoint, every lot in the county is zoned. Not every lot in the county is a legal lot. They're kind of independent of each other. Now, I will say, however, that we feel confident that this is a legal lot. The allegations of error in here with regard to legal lot, I don't think that there's actually anything substantively there. I mean, it's been preliminarily determined it was a legal lot. When a portion of this property was broken off and sold to eWeb, they did the preliminary determination of a legal lot. Now, if the portion that was sold to eWeb was legal when that process took place, then by extension, actually, this is also a legal lot. However, that still will be dealt with at the time of development, but I would state that it is, we feel confident it's a legal lot, and secondly, it's irrelevant whether it's a legal lot or not. So, and then just quickly, some of these assignments of error, as we go through what's highlighted in the letter, one of the things that was not highlighted in here by Landwatch is that the local government may decide the conflicting use should be fully allowed, notwithstanding the possible impacts on the resource site, that being subsection C under sub 5. So we can kind of focused on this, kind of second dependent clause here of subsection B and highlighted that. However, the fact that there's a conflict exists is not determinative of the analysis, that we acknowledge the conflict and argue that the use should be fully allowed anyway, which is within the power of this body. Going through there to page 4, and I'm just kind of running through sort of take issue with my statement that there's ample habitat for big game animals throughout Lane County. Industrial forest land is a large amount of land in Lane County. They say that there's no substance. This is not a substantive justification for further intrusion. We think that that in fact, the fact that there is a very healthy deer population that will have a long-going and does have a long-going and will always have a long-going habitat base is actually relevant to the issue. I mean, the qualifying lands for marginal land are finite. Only 0.1% of land in Lane County will qualify for marginal land. It's probably opposed of, well, I don't cite it in there, but 60% of land in federal ownership in large tracts that'll never be developed. So we think on balance, we in fact did address that. So basically, it seems to me that they're sort of taking issue around some specific statements without addressing the core of the argument. They say that there's no evidence that a primary limiting factor in cougar populations is human tolerance. Well, the number of animals has gone from a very small amount to a much larger amount with regard to having regulations. The same thing is true with elk, and species management plans note this. There are far more elk in 2016 in Oregon than there were in 1900 in Oregon, and that is because of the way that they've been managed. So elk are not exactly in crisis at this stage. In fact, the human tolerance for these species does in fact play a large role in how many of the animals there will be. They state that our statement that proposed density would be consistent with existing densities in the vicinity of the subject property is false. That is not the case. I mean, if you look at densities with regard to just zoning, maybe they might have some sort of argument there at least. But I mean, when I did this, I looked at the number of houses or number of parcels with addresses in a 1 mile, 2 mile, and 3 mile square, divided that by the area within those squares, and came up with a series of figures. In fact, the ranges go from about 13 acres average size to 16 acres in average size. We're producing 20 acres in average. Our proposal will be for 20 acres in size. So in fact, the existing development pattern in the area is very much in line with what we're proposing. And the statement that it is not is false. Our statement that it is simply supported by evidence in the record. I can't think of another way to figure out actual density than that. So, I don't believe that there's anything here that would be fatal to our application or really requires much substantial reconsideration. It seems like there's sort of some issue taken with the economic consequences or the determination that some of the economic activities that may take place on marginal land are made more likely on a smaller lot size. Sort of takes issue with that determination. However, that determination isn't necessarily just one that I made, but that the state legislature made, and it's been sort of a policy through the county. Regarding economic consequences, to Mr. Kirby, I would say that it does make it, and that's one of the things that they took issue with, is that he shouldn't be entitled to rely on additional development, or that he could conceivably have additional development on this property, so there's no impact to him. But I would say that, as he's planning his life, he's certainly been, I would say it would have an impact on him. He is, to some extent, entitled to rely on the precedent that he's seen gone before him. I mean, this is the way these properties have been treated in the past. He has met these criteria, and so there would be an economic impact to him as well. So like I said, I haven't been able to fully rebut everything in Land Watch's letter as I perhaps could with more time. However, I don't feel that there's anything in here that requires the record being left open. As noted, they participated in the Planning Commission hearing, the initial Planning Commission hearing. That was some 2 months ago. So there's been, anyway, a substantial amount of time to kind of flesh out these issues. This is what we have here today, and I don't think there's anything here that rises to the level of requiring the record to be left open for us to further rebut.
Okay.
So,
Commissioner Lycan, I believe, has a question.
Well, no, not necessarily a question. I just, there are times I think when less is more. And I'm just going to throw this out to you. My family was the largest residential developer in Douglas County. And what we're trying to do here is just, we have a certain criteria, and we're just looking to basically, we have two areas we're looking at. And that is we're redesignating portions of the property from forest land designation to marginal land, and then the second request is all the subject property from impacted forest land to marginal lands. We're not getting involved in this is what this is. It's a rezone. We're not talking about necessarily lots and what's going to happen there. Is this correct?
Right. I mean, as both Lindsay and the applicant's representative have stated, we are just looking at what the approval criteria are for the plan amendment zone.
And that's really what where we are today. And so that's what we're specifically looking at. So I appreciate the information you're providing for us, but the reality is, I think a lot of that information would come at a future date once you get to the point when potential development may occur. And so I'll just throw that out to you. The other is a question I have, and I don't know if we have this information from Oregon Department or from ODFW. If you remember correctly, about 8 months ago, we were declaring a drought here in Lane County. The Cascades now have a snowpack of over 15 feet. Commissioner Bozovich and I were just talking recently that Lake Shasta is now over 100% capacity, and in late July and August, you couldn't even see it from the highway. So my question is, doesn't that impact? Doesn't the weather actually impact how wildlife, where they're going to be, where they're going to go from here and there? I mean, it would be interesting to get that, because frankly, I think the case he's making here is very legit. But weather does impact where wildlife is going to go. Frankly, you've seen so many come down low because the vegetation was gone up above because of lack of water. So they're coming down lower. I think I don't have an issue with the wildlife. That's the point I'm making. I think because of where we are today and where compared to where we were just this last 8 months ago, when we were looking at, my gosh, are we going to be running out of water? And today that has changed dramatically. So, but I think we just have a certain criteria we're looking at, and I appreciate the information. I think a lot of that information will be much more valuable as you proceed into the future when potential development occurs. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And but I appreciate it. I don't think you need to necessarily go through each of the criteria of Lane Land Watch. I mean, that came in, and that's why I made that statement like I did, because frankly, they're asking for a week to keep the record open, but then at the back of it, the conclusion was we oppose it. Well, why would you want to keep the record open for a week when you already oppose it? That's just my thought on that, and I'll just leave it at that. But I just want to make sure I understood that was our criteria, that this is what we're looking at. Very good. Thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner Swanson.
Thank you very much. In the submission that Landwatch sent in today, they said it appears to be the case that Lane County RCP does not comply with Goal 5, as Lane County has not adopted a program to achieve Goal 5 compliance for big game habitat. Rather, Lane County allows applicants to write their own EC report to justify plan amendments. And then they go on to say the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife recommendations on overall residential density for protection of big game shall be used to determine the allowable number of residential units within regions of the county. Any density above that limit shall be considered to be in conflict with Goal 5 and will be allowed only after resolution in accordance with the requirements and application procedures. So my question for both of you is, first of all, with the area having been designated peripheral big game range, is there a relationship between the requirements of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for certain density requirements and what you're asking us to do today?
So, my understanding is that beyond the recommendation that you cite, there has been no other work or justification to answer that question.
Well, their letter says that the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife says that they shall be used, these recommendations shall be used to determine the allowable number of residential units. It seems pretty strong that they shall be used.
Then you go through the ESEE process, which hasn't been. And that was sort of a placeholder. In fact, when that was put in the county code, it said, and then it deferred this analysis for specific areas of the county until a later date.
Okay.
So that's kind of a rough use for all the peripheral big game in the county. Well, there's a lot of peripheral big game habitat in the county. So a general guideline of 40 acres is a general guideline, and then you move to the specific requirements and the performance of the ESEE analysis, and because that hasn't been done, then that's deferred to work that the applicant has to do, which then makes it further challenging because I have to get on the phone and ask ODFW, do you have anything that shows areas of the county where elk use, and how, and why, and what? And the answer, unfortunately, is no.
Do you think that these recommendations apply or not?
The
Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
It does apply. That's how we identify that there's a conflict.
Okay.
And then we move to the conflicts analysis.
Okay. Now, Ms. Eichner, could you give me what you understand to be the county's position on this, that these recommendations from Fish and Wildlife do not have to be used to determine the allowable number of residential units, which seems to conflict with their quoting this sentence that they shall be used? This is on page 4 of their letter.
Right, yeah, they're quoting RCP policy, and that sets a benchmark of what the density should be in these areas. And then, like you said, we put it on the applicant to provide us an ESEE analysis to justify how they can go below that 1 house per 40 acres with minimal impacts or minimal conflict.
Well, I'm just asking. I'm asking whether or not the policy that Landwatch is quoting, they're quoting a policy that the counties have to follow this, and if it's been designated as this type of habitat for these types of animals, then we have to comply with that. We have to have landowners comply with it, and we can't let them use the EC analysis to explain the conflict. They just have to follow the rules. And I'm just asking, is that accurate?
Could I?
Why doesn't the second sentence
I was about to say.
Any density above that limit shall be considered to conflict with Goal 5 and will be allowed only after resolution in accordance with OAR 660-1600.
Which is what we're doing.
And so that's what the applicant has provided in this additional analysis.
Oh, okay.
So this is a policy in our RCP, but we believe, I think that's what Lindsay was saying, is that essentially it's kind of either this, and if you don't meet this 40 acres, you have this opportunity to provide this additional information. The applicant provided that additional information. Planning staff has reviewed it. County council has reviewed it. We believe they've provided the justification for going.
Are we then saying basically there's a rule, and the rule is you have to meet this 40-acre density, but if you want to exceed that, you can provide this EC analysis, and then that EC analysis is considered by the board or city or governing jurisdiction, and then we can take a look at that and make a decision. Is that your view? Okay.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that always comes up when people ask for extensions, and they ask for additional time, is we usually want to know the position of the people that are trying to get the application, and their rights are affected by how much time this all takes. And on the one hand, if you say, we don't want the extension, we want you to make a decision based on the record, then the good news is you'll get a decision. The bad news is you won't find out what additional comments the other people are going to make, which they're going to use in a subsequent appeal, and that may or may not be to your benefit to know what they're going to argue later. And I just wanted to get your opinion on whether you were in favor or opposed to this request for a delay.
We'd be opposed to the request for a delay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
Other questions? All right. Thank you. So is there anyone in the audience that would like to testify in favor, in addition? How about folks that just want to give testimony? All right. I assume that means there was none. Is there any additional comments by staff?
I don't have any, do you?
No.
No.
Carl, is there anything else? No? Okay. So at this time, the next thing is to close the hearing. Is that appropriate at this time, legal counsel?
Yes.
Okay. Then I'll close the public hearing. And we'll look to the board for discussion and deliberation. Mr. Bozovic?
Thank you. So first, I just want to deal with whether we need to hold the record open or not. My understanding that this has been noticed twice in the Register Guard, and that the Planning Commission decision was on January 19th, almost 2 months ago. So there's been, now since the Planning Commission decision, has there been any additional information submitted by the applicant?
No.
So the record stands as of that decision, and there was over almost 2 months to comment on that. I just want to make that clear, because I don't think there's any reason to hold the record open at this point. And I did take the time to read the entire Land Watch letter since it was submitted prior to this hearing, so I was well aware of it and went back and forth between it and the EC over lunchtime, so I'm satisfied there. It's obvious that, this meets, all the tests as far as income and productivity. There's no question about that, and there was no objection to that by Land Watch. The only real question is whether or not it meets the goal, resolves the Goal 5 conflict well enough for us to determine it's provable. Many discussions obviously were held in Planning Commission. They unanimously approved the application. As I look at it, and looking through the analysis, I agree with the applicant's analysis. I think this does resolve, the conflict between 40 acres and 20 acre parcels. Anyone that's driven up Hawkins or any of the South Hills understands there's not an issue with deer population in the South Hills of Eugene or that area, and in particular that the elk herd referred to. I'm fairly familiar with, seeing I kind of drive up and down Territorial all the time, and Highway 36, there's 2 large resident elk herds around the West Eugene perimeter of west side of Eugene. The one resident herd around Crow, which I never have seen come in past the dairy farm that's just to the west of Pine Grove and Crow Road there. So this is well out of their range. And then the other one's way up by Highway 36, which I've only seen come as far south as the airport at times. But that's, this is not really an elk range, so I don't really see the impact to either the elk population, obviously not the deer population. They seem to do quite well with higher density housing. And I don't think we've actually had cougar sightings and actually cougar predation in the South Hills, just ask folks that raise chicken or goats around that area. So we're not really dealing with a cougar population issue either. So I think it's been resolved, and I do believe there is economic benefit to the smaller lot size going down to 20 acres. I don't buy the argument that there isn't. And with that, I think I will be supporting the application.
Mr. Farr?
Thank you. You know, I used to be the manager of Gray's Garden Centers, and we sold a lot of roses because of the deer in the South Hills. A lot of roses. But I have a question for you, Mr. Clark. If a motion were made to hold the record open for 1 week, what would that do to a third reading?
Well, let me run through it. There's been a request to hold the record open for a week. If that's a motion and that's approved by the board, that would be granted for whatever days you decide, at least 7. Under the statute for quasi-judicial land use decisions, of which this is one, either party, applicant, opponents, are entitled to at least 7 days to hold the record open after the initial evidentiary hearing. Mm-hmm. The legal question I can't answer right now is this considered the first evidentiary hearing, or was the one in front of the Planning Commission the first evidentiary hearing? Lindsay reminds me that the last marginal lands application we did for Iverson, Bill Close made the argument that this board accepted, which is the evidentiary hearing. The first one was the one in front of the Planning Commission, not this board, and therefore there wasn't a legal requirement to grant that. Okay. That being said, this board can go either way on that request. The statute requires 7 days for the applicant to respond to anything submitted. During that 7 days, you're talking about 2 weeks if the board goes that route. It would be appropriate in that circumstance to set a third reading and potentially deliberation and approval out, I would think, 3 weeks to allow additional evidence to come in and be reviewed, and staff can address if necessary. So in terms of timelines, that's what I would expect.
Okay. And a follow-up question, and staff feels that the evidence presented in the review by the staff is substantial at this point in time, and you are recommending passage of the ordinance today? Okay. Yes. I have no such motion at this point.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Mr. Lyken?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move approval of Ordinance PA 1320 in the matter of amending the Rural Comprehensive Plan to redesignate land from forest to marginal land and rezone land from impacted forest land F2 to marginal land MLSR with site review and adopting savings and severability clauses.
Second.
We have a second. Further discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Mokaiski, can you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Sorensen?
No.
Commissioner Farr?
Yes.
Commissioner Lyken?
Aye.
Commissioner Bozevich?
Aye.
Commissioner Stewart?
Aye. Passes 4 to 1. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So item 13 on our agenda is to review assignments. Got a few, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I had 3 here, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Farr requested that we bring back a report on what other municipalities are doing related to animal licensing programs in other municipalities. So we'll coordinate that with Mr. Russell and our agenda team. Commissioner Lyken asked that we look at the Lynn County litigation regarding minimum wage, and sick leave was added to that related to unfunded mandates. So we'll have that discussion as well at agenda team and add that to our assignments. And then Commissioner Bozevich asked for a letter to the U.S. Forest Service regarding the Indian Creek Landscape Management Plan. We actually clarified the deadline is April 18th, which is good. Mr. Kyler is going to be out for some period prior to when we thought the deadline was, so that gives us a little bit additional time to put together thoughtful comments for the board to consider. So we'll bring that forward prior to the April 18th deadline. So I had those 3. I'm not sure if I missed anything.
Did we miss anything? All right, not seeing. So we've already done our executive session. Is there other business? See none. Commissioner Farr?
Just a question for Ms. Mokrowski. We were talking about animals earlier. I have a question for you. We were talking about last night about badgers, and can you answer a question that came up last night? How do you keep badgers out of your backyard?
I don't know. Is there a punchline here?
It came up last night. You just put up a set of goalposts.
Comment.
Oh, boy.
So with that, our next board meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, March 29th, so we'll be off next week for spring break. And for those of you that have plans, enjoy it. Hopefully we'll get some nice spring weather.
Have fun spring skiing.
And we'll see you next time on Sports Talk KLA.
All right, so with that, we're adjourned.